lucky enough to have the chief economist with ATB Financial with us today. He is here for a competitiveness talk this afternoon, so I was able to convince him to leave Calgary very early this morning to come and join us. This is Todd Hirsch, so please welcome him.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to come down. I don't know how many times now I've spoken at Medicine Hat College, but it's always a real thrill to be back here. I love talking to students too, by the way. I used to teach a class at the University of Calgary, which I've had to stop doing for the time being, but it really made me sad because I love any chance I can get to talk to students. So it's really nice to be here this morning in your class here. And in the back is my colleague, Maria. She's just, so in case you're wondering, who is that lady sort of hovering in the back? She's traveling with me today, and we're off to Lethbridge after this afternoon. So thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me. The presentation that I've got, are things back to normal yet, in brackets? An Alberta economic forecast for 2015. I get asked this question a lot as an economist. People will ask me, are things back to normal in the economy? Now that question, are things getting back to normal, there is a lot of presuppositions. What do we mean by normal? Is normal good? I think when people ask that, are things getting back to normal? I think they refer to it as we want it back to a good situation. After the global meltdown that we saw a few years ago, I think people are looking for things to be normal again in a good sense. But is normal always good? There's a lot of situations where you might say, well, normal might not be exactly where you want to be. All of you are too young to remember this, but I grew up in Alberta in the decade of the 1980s, where the economy was not good. And for many, many years, the economy was very difficult and high levels of unemployment and almost impossible to find work. In that sense, normal is not really where you want to be. You didn't want a normal economy in Alberta. You wanted something abnormal. You wanted an economy that was growing. Well, fortunately now in 2014, we do have an economy in the province that is growing very nicely. What I want to do is talk about a few of the situations around the global economy that is affecting the Canadian and the Alberta economy. We'll talk about our friends to the south, the Americans, because it's always important to understand what's going on in the U.S. economy for anyone in Canada or Alberta, because we trade so much with our American friends. And then we'll talk about Canada, and then finally specifically what's going on here in this province and what maybe we can expect in 2015. This is another word I hear a lot, crisis. Economists love to use this word, and we talk about, the crisis, almost crisis with a capital C in front of it. And really what we're talking about when you hear an economist refer to the crisis, they're referring to what happened to the global economy, the economic and financial meltdown of 2008 and 2009. All of that phrase is shorthanded now, and we just say the crisis. And we talk about, since the end of the crisis, or, numbers between the crisis and now. We're referring to that very, very steep and very painful global recession of about 6 years ago. But in a lot of ways, I think we need to stop talking as economists, or stop talking about the crisis, because it kind of weighs like a heavy dark cloud on the psychology of people. It's almost like this crisis is still sort of on our doorsteps. I get this more in central Canada, where the economy is not as good as it is here in Alberta. In Alberta, we don't talk so much anymore about the crisis. But the crisis, I think we need to start putting behind us. A person born at the beginning of the crisis is now in grade 2. This is not a recent event. In some ways, this is kind of a historic event. And I think we need to start talking about it as something that happened, 6 years ago, and is no longer kind of right on our doorstep. Let's talk about some situations going on around the world. Let's talk about the Middle East, first of all. Now, I hope you guys pay attention to news and watch news or read news. How many of you read newspapers? A couple of you. Most of you probably get your news online, probably news sources and news feeds and things like that. I hope you pay attention to what's going on in the news, and especially some of the really interesting things in the geopolitical world right now. The Middle East is not a happy place. Now, you could ask, is this normal or is this abnormal? I would argue for the last 50 years, turmoil in the Middle East, very sadly, but turmoil in the Middle East, that's kind of a normal state of event. What we're seeing in 2014, though, is a bit abnormal because now with ISIS and the air strikes by the U.S. and other countries on ISIS in Iraq and northern Syria, these things are having some abnormal effects. And I think there will be some economic ripple effects that spread out. What's going on in the Middle East is a political event, but it does weigh on people's, I guess, optimism as consumers. I'll talk a little bit more about the U.S. consumer in just a moment. But as consumers, or as people who are just trying to get by in their daily lives, anytime you turn on the news and you read about the U.S. or Canada, moving towards perhaps a war situation against ISIS, people will start to feel less optimistic. They'll start to feel less like spending money, making investments in their businesses, maybe buying new homes. Because anytime there is war, that's just a natural reaction. So what's going on in the Middle East, not great situation in 2014. I would say it's a bit abnormal. But I do think 2015, we will see this kind of escalation of tensions and violence perhaps escalate a little bit. And that will have some negative effect, I think, around the global economy. Now, this picture here is very disturbing for many reasons. This is Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia. For some reason, he doesn't have a shirt on. He's riding a grizzly bear, and I can only assume this photo is a Photoshopped photo. But you don't know what this man is capable of. I don't know if I'm entirely convinced that he actually can't ride a grizzly bear. He's splashing through the river for some reason. What we are seeing in 2014 with the tensions between Russia and Ukraine, this, again, is an abnormal situation. Now, it's not abnormal to see a country invade another country or two countries at war. In fact, a lot of that is really quite normal if you look over the history of mankind. But to see a G8 country, or maybe a former member of the G8, we're not really sure of Russia's status at the G8 table these days, but to see a country within the G8 group of countries actively invading another sovereign country and going against sort of the consensus of the other G7, flagrantly sort of, defying everyone else in the world. This is an abnormal situation, and again, kind of a troubling one. Now, the picture is funny, but I don't want to make light of what's happening in Ukraine, because certainly what's going on there is not funny at all. It's very troubling. What makes this situation even worse is the fact that the United States, Europe, NATO, Canada, we're not really quite sure what to do or how to respond. So far, the only response has really been some trade sanctions against Russia, which may or may not sort of do the trick. But so far, there hasn't been anything really much stronger than, well, we are going to limit, how much we trade with you, Russia, because we don't like what you're doing in Ukraine. But the country that has the most at stake in all of this is Germany. Now, why do we care so much about Germany? Here in Canada, we don't really trade all that much with Germany. We trade even less with Russia. So why does any of this really matter for Canada? Well, it does matter what's going on in Germany, because Germany, within the European Union, it's not only the largest country within the European Union, but it's also the strongest economy. And up until very recently, Germany was kind of doing all the growth for the European Union. A lot of those other countries in Europe, Spain and Italy and Portugal, great wine, lousy economies, 25% unemployment in Spain. Their economies are kind of caught in a real stagnation. Germany and Northern Europe, you could throw in the Scandinavian countries, that's really the only kind of pocket of growth in the European Union right now. And if we lose Germany to some sort of recession triggered by trade sanctions with Russia, then it's all bets are off again for the European Union. It could be enough to, in fact, tilt all of Europe back into recession once again. And if Europe goes back into recession and financial markets start to wobble, then this does have ripple effects around the global economy. We would feel them here in Canada as well. So we don't want to lose Germany to recession. We don't want to lose Europe to recession. But a lot hangs in the balance with what Mr. Putin does in 2015. We could see these trade sanctions intensify between Russia and the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. So we'll have to watch this very closely. But certainly this situation between Russia and Ukraine is abnormal, and it could potentially have some pretty big economic consequences. All right, let's talk about China. This dragon representing China. When I saw this picture, I thought, first of all, it's the Pink Panther. I don't think it's supposed to be the Pink Panther, but the Chinese economy has actually really slowed down quite a lot in the last. Are we losing the camera? The Chinese economy has moderated from the growth rates it was posting maybe a decade or so ago. About 10 years ago, the Chinese economy was galloping ahead about 10 or 11 or 12% real GDP growth rates. These days, it's moderated to probably around 6 or 7% real GDP growth. Now, if you were in Canada or the United States or anywhere in Europe, 6 or 7% real GDP growth rate, that would be an astounding rate of growth. Very, very fast. But for China, it does represent a distinct sort of slowing down in their economy. So we asked the question again, well, why does it matter for us here in Canada how quickly China's economy is growing? We do trade with China, still just a fraction of what we trade with the United States. We don't actually send all that much to China, but we do trade with China. But why China's growth is more important for the Canadian economy is that growth in China is what's supporting global commodity prices. China being the purchaser of a lot of things like base metals, a lot of copper, a lot of nickel, a lot of iron ore, a lot of forest products, energy products, just about any natural resource commodity, China is busy buying a lot of to support growth in their economy. And if their economy is slowing down, they're going to be purchasing less. And if they purchase less, right, if the demand of some commodity falls, what happens to the price? If demand falls, the price of that commodity will also fall. Canada, being a huge exporter of natural resources, even though we might not sell all that much to China, it's that world price for our natural resources that will suffer. And with the slowdown in China, we're already seeing a lot of drop in price. Things like base metals have really kind of fallen about 30% in price. That actually makes it more difficult for Canadian mining companies and for Canadian exporters of natural resources like base metals. So Canada does have a lot at stake in what happens in China. My guess is that the Chinese economy will kind of level off around 6 or 7%. I'm not expecting their economy to slow down a tremendous amount more than it already has. But we do have to watch very carefully. A lot sort of matters with what goes on in China as to how the Canadian economy is going to perform next year. All right. Let's turn then to our friends to the south, our BFFs, as I like to call them, the Americans. Well, here's where Mr. Washington is smiling a little more broadly these days and more smiles on the faces of Americans. Now, since the crisis, that economic recession about 6 years ago, it's been a long, difficult slog for the U.S. economy. A lot of years of kind of false starts. You know, the economic indicators would look like they're okay, and then it would all kind of fall flat again. A lot of years of not very good growth at all. But 2014 actually is shaping up to be the best year of growth the U.S. has seen in quite some time. And the economic indicators that economists like to watch every month, things like retail sales and things like the housing market, things like the labor market, what's the unemployment rate like? For the last about 8 or 10 months, growth in the United States has shown some convincing momentum. So it's no longer just a couple of months of growth and then it falls flat. We've seen now a pretty convincing trend of growth in the U.S. economy. All that is really fantastic news for Canada because, as we know, Canada, about 80% of our exports go to the U.S. economy. And if the U.S. is not growing, Canada is probably not growing very well either. So it's really great news that the U.S. economy is showing some better results, especially on the labor market side. So how many Americans are working? How many are still looking for work? We've seen some real improvements in the job market in the United States. So at the peak of the economic recession back in 2010, the unemployment rate in the United States topped out at 10.2%. Now that's a very high level of unemployment for a country like the United States. The last rating we have, it's fallen now to 5.9%. And 5% would be what economists would generally count as a balanced job market. That's sort of where you want the unemployment rate. You don't want it too low, then it makes it too difficult for workers or for companies to find workers. You obviously don't want the unemployment rate too high. You kind of want it just right, the Goldilocks rate of unemployment, 5%. And they're at 5.9%. Now, the unemployment rate has fallen in the U.S. for two reasons. One reason is a good reason, and that is there's more jobs being created. About 200,000 jobs every month on average over the last year or so. A lot more jobs being created. That's the good reason. The bad reason why the unemployment rate has also fallen, and this is kind of a trouble for the U.S., is that there's been so many workers who have become discouraged that they've given up looking for work. If you become so discouraged that you can't find a job, that you actually stop looking for a job and just kind of resign to the fact that you're just going to stay in your parents' basement and play video games, if you stop looking for work, you are no longer counted as unemployed. And then you drop out of those statistics of unemployment. So that's what we've seen a lot of. We've seen a lot of jobs being created, people going back to work, but we've also seen over the last 5 or 6 years a lot of discouragement in the job market, people who quit looking, and that's bad. That represents a lot of underutilized labor that could be or should be out there kind of being productive and adding to the labor market. So nonetheless, the discouraged workers is a problem, but the U.S. economy is showing much, much better results in 2014, and probably will continue on into 2015. We'll see some good growth. So if the U.S. is growing, you could say the U.S. is the smartest kid in class. The problem is the class is remedial summer school. So the U.S. is maybe what we would call the sharpest kid and a bunch of dullards. The rest of the global economy, as we mentioned, Europe, the Japanese economy, still very, very stagnant growth in Japan. So the U.S. is showing good results, along with the United Kingdom. Those are about the only two countries of any size that are actually showing economic momentum picking up in 2014. And it's really a good thing for the global economy that at least the United States and the United Kingdom are showing some growth. Let's turn to the Canadian economy and talk about what's happening on this side of the border. 2014, and actually the last couple of years in Canada, have been a little bit soft overall for the Canadian economy. We'll talk about what's happening in Alberta here, because that's a separate story. But for the Canadian economy, actually growth has been pretty squishy for the last few years. The big reasons for this softness in the Canadian economy, when you look at how economists measure the gross domestic product, the measure of all the goods and services being produced, and maybe you guys look at some of these things in your courses, there's sort of 4 components to it. One is how much consumers are spending. One is how much governments are spending. One is how much businesses are spending, and one is how much we are exporting to the rest of the world. Those are the 4 major components of the gross domestic product. And it's the last 2, business investment and exports, that have really been kind of stuck in the mud for the last few years. They really have not picked up as we thought they would be at this point. Now, there's some good questions as to why exports and businesses have not been, why businesses haven't been purchasing new equipment and machinery and investing in their facilities. A lot of it, I think, has to do with they might still be a little bit nervous. That word crisis still maybe hangs over their head in a negative way. But exports and business investment, those are the 2 pieces of the puzzle that have yet to really kick in. I love this picture here. This is a Black Friday. So shoppers in Canada lined up. You can see just hundreds of people waiting for the stores to open. In contrast, this is how it looked in the U.S. These are American shoppers on Black Friday. A lot more enthusiasm and a lot more sort of energy there. Probably a little bit too much enthusiasm, you might say. But I think it kind of contrasts how the Canadian economy has not been performing as well in the last year or so as the U.S. economy. So the question then becomes, well, when do we expect the Canadian economy to pick up some speed? When do we expect those exports to the U.S. and the rest of the world to kick in? And when do we expect businesses to actually get back to spending money on investing in new machinery and equipment? Well, the Bank of Canada, if you can see the slide, it's a little bit dim here, but the Bank of Canada, they have an interesting analogy, I think, to explains why the Bank of Canada, every quarter they make a forecast where they think the Canadian economy is going next. And for the last 3 years, the Bank of Canada, they describe the economy as having shown serial disappointment. In other words, quarter after quarter, the Bank of Canada's estimates of the economy are wrong. They look at the current numbers and they say, well, next quarter things are going to pick up, and then it doesn't, And the next quarter again, and then the results come in and it's disappointing. Serial disappointment over the last 3 years. One of the problems that the Bank of Canada is having with trying to forecast where the economy is going is that it relies heavily on these models that they have. They've got a bunch of mathematical models, econometric models, big computer systems that try to, you look at all the current numbers, you plug those all in, and the models will say, well, given all of that, this is where the economy should be going in the next quarter or so. But the analogy that the Bank of Canada uses is, so if you imagine the ancient mariners who would navigate the ocean waters, and you would use the stars at night to navigate. And the stars always provided reliable guidance. Didn't matter where you were, as long as you could see the stars, as long as the sky was clear, you knew that the stars would provide reliable direction. They were foolproof. But then you imagine a situation where a storm blows up, maybe a 3 or 4 day storm, like a hurricane or something, and it would blow this boat so far off course that the boat actually passes beneath the equator and into the southern hemisphere. So when the sky is finally clear and the waters calm down and the mariners look up at the stars, they realize these stars aren't giving us any guidance anymore. These stars are all different. We don't know how to read these stars. So the boat isn't crashing, but the stars are no longer providing guidance. And that way the ship is kind of lost, at least until the mariners learn how to read the new arrangement of stars in the south. This is kind of where the Bank of Canada is right now. The traditional mathematical models that they always used, they always provided them good guidance on where the economy was going. But since that global recession and since the economic crisis of a few years ago, the world has changed, and the stars in the sky, so to speak, have also changed. The bank's models are not giving it the same kind of guidance that were always so reliable in the past. They've failed, in fact, to predict that, in fact, that the Canadian economy is not picking up steam. And that's why they were always wrong with these models. My guess is that 2015, however, will be a better turnaround year for the Canadian economy. Exports are bound to pick up for two reasons. One is, as we've talked about, the U.S. economy doing much better. So growth is returning to the U.S., and they'll start buying more of the things we sell. The other reason why exports are certain to pick up is the Canadian dollar is much softer than it was a year ago. And if you guys travel or go to the States much, or if you look at the value of the Canadian dollar, you know that it's about 10 cents less than it was about a year ago. And for the past few years, trading close to par with the U.S. dollar. Now it's about 89, 90 cents U.S. to buy one Canadian dollar. So the softer Canadian dollar will help the value of those exports. The stronger U.S. economy will also help. So I think exports will pick up. The business investment side of it is a trickier question, because then it gets down to the psychology and the fear factors, why businesses are kind of reluctant to get out and spend. They've got a lot of cash. If you look at the balance sheets of corporate Canada, they're in good fiscal shape or financial shape. They got a lot of money in their bank accounts, generally. I mean, I don't want to say that for every single company, but generally, businesses are awash in cash. They're just reluctant to spend it because I think they fear that perhaps the global recession is going to return. Or they maybe want to still have a bit more convincing evidence that if they invest in new machinery and equipment and new products, that in fact consumers will want to buy them. My guess is that in 2015 we will finally start to see business investment kick in as well, because I do think that the signals will be there for businesses that they'll be a little bolder and finally get out and open their wallets and invest in new machinery and equipment. So all that is to say, I think 2015 will be a much better year for the Canadian economy, particularly in Ontario and Quebec, where their economy is that's where really kind of the softness in Canada is being seen. I just came back actually yesterday from Central Canada, and having spent the last 4 days down there, and having been at some economic conferences, boy, the mood in Ontario is a much different mood than what you're seeing here in Alberta. They're still dealing with high levels of unemployment, really kind of a difficult job market. Young people coming out of universities and colleges are at best looking at sort of part-time service sector jobs, and it's discouraging for them. So they're looking for growth to pick up in Ontario and Quebec, and I think we'll start to see that a little bit stronger growth next year. Okay, but now let's turn to Alberta. This is our provincial flag, in case any of you don't know that. Thinking, what's this flag he's showing? This is Alberta's flag. You guys know this. Alberta's economy is a bit abnormal. If we get back to that original question, are things back to normal? Alberta's economy is abnormal when you compare it to what's going on in the rest of the country, because growth here in Alberta has been consistently quite strong over the last few years. Coming out of the recession, and Alberta did experience quite a sharp recession. 2009, in fact, our economy shrank about 4%. But it came bouncing back in 2010, and ever since then, Alberta's economy has actually posted some pretty good levels of growth. Last year, we grew at about 3.9% real GDP growth. About the fastest in the country. Actually, Newfoundland and Labrador eked us out. It's a smaller province, but their oil-driven economy lifted that province to even faster growth. But Alberta's economy is abnormal because we are showing some very nice, healthy, balanced levels of growth. The unemployment rate in Alberta right now, 4.9%. That's almost exactly where we want it. And it's been a little bit lower, between 4.5% and 5%. That's kind of where it's been hovering for the last few years. Nice, I would say, a nice balanced job market. We'll talk about job shortages and foreign temporary workers in a moment, because that's an issue for Alberta. But the big sectors driving Alberta's economy, well, it continues to be the energy sector, the oil and gas sector. And I know this part of the province particularly is driven more by natural gas than places in northern Alberta, which are driven more by oil and oil sands. But generally, the energy sector in Alberta has been performing pretty well. Now, we've seen these oil prices dip down in the last little while. Again, I don't know how closely you guys follow the price of West Texas Intermediate. It seems everybody in downtown Calgary knows minute by minute what the price of West Texas Intermediate is doing. But there we have seen actually the price of crude oil in North America drop by about $15 a barrel. So it was trading at about $105 US a barrel of oil. Now it's trading below $90 US a barrel. And it's kind of hovering right around that $90 range. Well, is this bad news for Alberta? Or should we be worried that these oil prices have slumped? I don't think at this point it's worth worrying about. Yeah, oil producers, they'd always like to see oil prices higher if they can get it. Who wouldn't? If you're selling oil, why wouldn't you want it at $100 or $120? But at $90, I think Alberta's energy sector is still in pretty good shape. The question becomes, what if it falls another $20 and we get to that $80 or $70 range? Well, even at $80, a lot of projects in Alberta, a lot of those projects in Fort McMurray and the oil sands, they start to become a bit iffy. They're very, very expensive projects. Our oil in Alberta is very expensive, especially in the oil sands, to extract that oil, and they need a high price. And labor costs and material costs are pushing the prices, or I guess the costs of those projects even higher. At $80, a lot of those projects in Fort McMurray become questionable. At $70, a lot of them become uneconomic. And certainly any point below $70, we'd be in real trouble. And it also depends on how long energy prices stay low. If they slump down to $70 or $60 and they stayed there for a few years, this province is in a different situation and not a good one. I mean, the provincial government depends heavily on energy resource revenues. And if producers can't make any money, they shut up shop, and that will restrict how much money is available to the provincial government. But at $90, we're still in pretty good shape. Any number of guesses. I mean, I listen to these very smart energy economists. Some people are predicting $50 oil. Some are predicting $130 oil. Most are predicting that they're probably going to balance out close to where they're at now. My guess is that in 2015, we'll end up in a price environment that is at least okay for Alberta's energy sector. Maybe some of those costs will be contained, and I think we'll end up in a spot where we're not going to have to see a lot of those projects canceled or postponed. But in Alberta, we always need to be prepared for anything, and it could, in fact, likely be that oil prices dip a little bit lower. But that's not my immediate guess. The other sector I like to talk about is agriculture, maybe a little bit more important for this part of the province than talking about oil sands. Agriculture, I always think, is kind of the forgotten star of Alberta's economy. Last year, 2013, was a record-setting year for farm cash receipts in Alberta. There's never been a year as good as 2013. A lot of it was because grain and oilseed prices, notably wheat and canola, those are our two main crops here in Alberta, were at record high prices last year. And we had a fantastic bumper crop last year. Almost everywhere in the province, conditions were just about ideal. So you see high prices, you see bumper crops, a record-setting year for farm cash receipts. 2014, we're in a bit of a different situation. Grain and oilseed prices have fallen. They haven't collapsed, but they've definitely come down from where they were last year. And growing conditions in Alberta in 2014 were only okay. Most parts of the province, some harvesting still sort of taking place in southern Alberta. Most parts of the province, harvest is kind of wrapped up by now. But it's looking to be about an average crop year. Not a disaster, but not a bumper crop like we saw in 2013. So we're seeing lower prices. We're seeing an average growing year. I think overall, farm cash receipts in 2014 will come off from where they were last year, but I think it'll still be decent. Offsetting the lower grain and oilseed prices, however, are really good prices for livestock. Cattle and hog prices, especially those cattle prices right now, they're at record highs at the moment. Now that could change. Livestock prices always fluctuate, but at the moment, really nice prices for cattle ranchers. Better prices they're lower than cattle prices, but hog farmers are also seeing better prices than they were a year ago. So the livestock side looking a little bit better, in fact, than the grain and oilseed, the crop side. But overall, I think agriculture will be a pretty decent one this year. The final sector that I want to mention, because I think it is telling of where Alberta consumers are right now, is the retail sector. How much people are out shopping. Well, here again, we are seeing record-setting levels of retail receipts. Albertans are in the mood to shop, and they are shopping hard. And when you look at it in per dollars, per capita spending, how much every person in Alberta is spending out in the malls and in the stores, it's way above the national average, about 25% higher than what Canadians and other provinces are spending. Well, why are we spending so much money? Well, there's a couple of factors. One is incomes in Alberta are also about 25% higher than they are in other provinces. Another factor is we are feeling very confident about job prospects and about our income in the coming years and months. So if you're feeling confident in your income and your jobs, you're going to be out spending more money. If you think you're going to get laid off tomorrow, you're probably not going to go out and buy anything you don't need. And the other reason why per capita spending in Alberta is so much higher than it is elsewhere is demographics. We have a much younger population in Alberta. A lot of people are moving here from other provinces, and a lot of people in that age 20 to 35 cohort, more so than other provinces. Proportionately, we have fewer seniors, and we have more young people in Alberta than other provinces. And what do young people like doing? Shopping, right? Especially if they're in that stage of life where they're maybe starting a family, they're buying baby strollers, they're buying hockey skates for their kids, they're buying houses. And when you buy a house, what goes in a new house? New carpet, new fridge, probably new clothes to wear in your new house, all of these sort of material kinds of things. And that's not bad. It's just the demographics of Alberta, our younger population, puts more people in that stage of life where they're accumulating things rather than saving, like seniors would be doing. So for a lot of those reasons, Albertans are spending a lot of money, record high levels of retail spending, also record amount of money being spent eating out. Restaurant and bar receipts in Alberta are through the roof. And again, I think that speaks to very confident Alberta consumers. If you are feeling like, oh, I'm never going to get a job, or I just got laid off, or I'm worried that I'm going to get laid off, the first thing you'll probably do is stop eating out, right? You'll take your lunch more, or you'll stay at home and cook more. You won't be going out for celebration, beers after the hockey games, and all of those things that I think Albertans like doing. We spend a lot of money entertaining ourselves in restaurants. So all those things, I think, speak to Alberta consumers that are feeling very, very confident. Okay, so my final slide then, getting back to that original question. Are things getting back to normal? Well, I guess if you compare Alberta to other provinces, no. We are in an abnormal situation. We are enjoying very healthy levels of growth. If you compare Alberta to where we've been over the last couple of years, I would say 2014 and into 2015, this is normal. We are enjoying this nice balanced level of growth. I think it'll continue next year. At the moment, our economics team at ATB Financial, we're forecasting for this year, 2014, real GDP growth of 3.7%, and next year 3.6%. In other words, as long as these energy prices hang in where they're at and agriculture continues to perform decently, I think the province will continue to enjoy next year the very nice, healthy levels of growth we're seeing currently. So, with that, I will conclude. I do want to point out quick, the OWL. This is a little newsletter that myself and I have another economist who works with me. We write this every morning. It's just a 60-second little blurb on some new statistic that's come out of Alberta. It's always focused on Alberta's economy. And why do we call it the OWL? Anyone know the significance of the OWL for Alberta particularly? The great horned owl, no one knows. What's Alberta's provincial bird? Do you even know we have a provincial bird? We do, and it is the great horned owl. You can go down to the Bird of Prey Center over in Coaldale. I think it's in Coaldale. The Birds of Prey Center, they've got beautiful great horned owls. Anyway, that's an aside. The great horned owl is our provincial bird. And owls are creatures that, if you've ever seen an owl, these are creatures that are very aware of what's going on around them. Nothing gets past an owl. They've got excellent eyesight, excellent hearing. So we thought the owl made a nice sort of symbol for our little daily economic newsletter focused on Alberta's economy. If you want to subscribe to it, it's entirely free. You will find it entertaining. You'll never be able to put it down. You can go to atb.com/economics and sign up for it. And in fact, I've got a little piece of swag for you on your way out the door to remind you to sign up for the OWL. My own website and my Twitter if you want to connect with me that way or follow my tweets. In fact, I was just tweeting out about being here at Medicine Hat College today. So with that, we've got some time. We've got some time, 15 minutes or so. I'd love to hear questions or if you guys have comments. Oh, sure. Okay. Yes.
Can you go down more specifically to medicine? Like, how many specific statistics on medicine hat? Because our economy is really different
Yeah.
than the larger Alberta economy.
It's a great question, and this is one thing I always struggle with because I monitor kind of the whole provincial economy. But when you do get into the medium-sized cities like Medicine Hat and Lethbridge and Red Deer, we don't have as good as statistics on the whole market. We do know, however, that southern Alberta, the economy is okay. It's good, I would say. As you move north across the province, the situation does get better. So if there is one soft spot in Alberta's economy, I would say it's kind of Medicine Hat right now. That's not to say things are terrible, but they're not as vibrant as they are right now in Grand Prairie or in Fort McMurray, where things are always kind of flying out of control. So I think a lot of that has to do with the economy, what it's driven by here in Medicine Hat. It is more oriented towards natural gas and not as much towards crude oil. That is one of the reasons for the softness here. And it also is an area where you're not seeing quite as much migration from other provinces or internationally. We do see some of it, but we're not seeing as much interprovincial migration, for example, to Medicine Hat as we are to places like Calgary or certainly in northern Alberta, where a lot of those jobs are. So, yeah. Oh, and I forgot to restate the question. The connection between natural gas and oil. Great question. There used to be, it's interesting, because if you used to look at the connection between natural gas and oil prices, they used to follow each other quite closely. But probably about 5 or 6 years ago, that connection kind of broke down. And now natural gas prices have tended to kind of be a bit flat, whereas oil prices tend to fluctuate and have, in fact, soared to over $100 a barrel. So that relationship between gas prices and oil prices, not as strong as it used to be, for a lot of different reasons. Some of the reasons having to do with the ability for Alberta to export natural gas versus the ability to export crude oil. And a lot of the refineries in the United States, they're actually looking for more Canadian crude oil. So that's one of the reasons why these oil prices have been lifted a little bit and natural gas prices have been a bit soft. And the other reason is there was a lot of natural gas supply coming out of the United States. And that kind of depressed gas prices, and they've never really recovered very, very strongly. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about temporary foreign workers and
Yeah.
how that
Oh, yeah.
kind of shifted and the impact that that may have on Alberta?
Right. So the question was about foreign temporary workers and the labor shortages that a lot of companies in Alberta are seeing. Alberta, again, to talk about an abnormal situation, talking to people and other economists in Ontario, they're not really too happy with the foreign temporary worker program. They see it as, well, this is just taking jobs away from other Canadians. In Alberta, the situation is different. Employers in Alberta are saying, well, we actually can't find Canadians who want these jobs, and I'm going to have to close up my shop if I can't find workers. So the foreign temporary worker program has provided a lot of workers to fill those vacancies. There's still questions about, well, could we be bringing more people from other parts of the country? Other Canadians in depressed parts of the East Coast, for example, places like New Brunswick, or Windsor, Ontario, where the unemployment rate is, close to 10%. Could we be bringing more people from other parts of the country to fill these positions, rather than, looking abroad and being so quick to bring in foreign temporary workers, or temporary foreign workers? My guess is that we have seen a few changes to the program over the summer. My guess is that Alberta companies are going to have to continue to rely on the temporary foreign worker program. And if they don't, if there's more changes to it that make it even more difficult, I think we might see a lot of challenge for especially the small business operators in Alberta. The other idea is, well, if you need workers, rather than bring them in from other parts of the world, we'll just raise wages. People will come, they'll move here from New Brunswick if the wages are decent. The problem with that, it sounds good, but as a small business operator, if you're going to raise wages, well, then you've got to raise the price on the goods and services you're selling. And there may or may not be much ability to raise price. How much will you pay for a hamburger? $9? At that point, people might say, well, I'm not buying that hamburger. I'm actually going to start taking my lunch. And then the business operator is out of business. So there's limits, I think, onto how high prices and wages can rise to attract other workers. Well, the one change that affects Alberta the most is employers can no longer have more than 10% of their workforce being a temporary foreign worker, whereas before there wasn't a limit on. And also, there is now the fee for applying for those temporary foreign workers has gone up from $250 per applicant to over $1,000. So higher cost. If you're a small business operator and you've got maybe 10 or 15 temporary foreign workers and you need more of them in 4 months, your cost is now quadrupled, your application cost for applying to the program to bring in these workers. And also, if you've got a small workforce, you can't have more than 1 in 10 as part of the program. So there are some limits and there's some cost hurdles now that employers in the province have to face. No, that's everyone. Yeah. Agriculture feels it the most. Actually, the highest user by sector is food and accommodation. So all the fast food outlets, not just fast food outlets, but all sort of food and restaurant, and also a lot of hotels, the accommodation industry. I was just speaking last week to the Hotel Association in Banff and Lake Louise, and they're like, we're doomed. If we are restricted to 10% of our workforce being temporary foreign workers, there's no way they're going to, they're actually quite pessimistic. Which is kind of too bad, because 2014 was a record-setting year for tourism in Banff and Lake Louise. These are good times. But now they're seeing that, well, we might actually have to close some of our hotel rooms because we don't have the staff to accommodate them. You know? Or a restaurant might have to say, well, we're only going to be open 4 days a week because we don't have enough staff. So it's a different kind of problem. It's a real problem. It's a different problem than they're having in Windsor, Ontario right now, where workers can't find anything to do. I mean, they'd be happy for a $15 an hour job washing dishes, but there aren't jobs like that in Windsor. In Banff and Lake Louise and agriculture in southern Alberta, it's the employers that are facing the real challenge right now. So the question is, what's the long-term idea that the government has in mind around temporary foreign workers? Or yeah. I think that some of the criticism actually that the opposition parties have for the government, and maybe they're good questions. So the question for the government is, well, what is your long-term plan for bringing in foreign temporary workers? And we heard the Premier of British Columbia say, yesterday that the solution is actually to look for more permanent immigration to Canada, rather than, saying, well, you can come here for 4 months and work in the donut store and then you have to, get out, or you have to reapply. Is this a long-term sort of job? To me, it sounds like this is a short-term, just to fill the gap temporarily, and there's companies in Alberta who need it. But is this a long-term kind of program, or is this taking the long view of how we should be looking at our labor market? Maybe if there are going to be chronic labor shortages, we need to be looking at bringing in more permanent immigration to Canada rather than just the 4 months at a time. Yeah?
Why was the class of 2008 and 2009 associated with global recession instead of a recession?
Oh, that's a good question. So the question was, why was the recession in 2008 and 2009 called a recession and not a depression? Great question. There's not really strict definitions for depressions. A recession, however, economists there in Canada, a recession is defined as you have 2 consecutive quarters, in other words, 6 complete months, where the economy is in fact contracting. A depression was a word, kind of a made-up word, to describe the very, very severe year-long recessions in the 1930s. So was it a depression? Some people might say it was, but technically it was a recession. It was more than 2 quarters of contraction in the Canadian economy, but then things came bounding back. And when you look at the economic pain of the Great Depression in the 30s, where here in Alberta the unemployment rate would have been 25%, even what we experienced in 2008 and 2009, it was severe and it was noted, but it wasn't the same economic kind of event as what happened in the 30s. So I guess that's the long answer. But the short answer is there's no technical definition of a depression. That was just the term they used to refer to what happened in the 30s.
Last question.
Everyone got their owl cloth? Oh, question at the back? Yeah? Yeah. What is my take on it? Well, there were a series of events that kind of happened in the mid-'80s. In fact, one story you guys will love. This is how old I am. I started high school in 1981. In September of 1981, the unemployment rate was 3.1%. That's a hotter economy than it is right now. When I graduated in June 1984, it was 12.6%. That's worse than the unemployment rate in New Brunswick is right now. Almost as bad as Greece. Like the economy had literally sort of collapsed in the matter of 3 years of me being in high school. It was a miserable time to graduate from high school. Really, the job prospects in Alberta were terrible. But what caused it? Well, one, I think the biggest one was that oil prices. Well, by today's dollars, they sound low, but oil prices went from $40 a barrel to $10 a barrel. Even $40 a barrel sounds impossibly low now. But the equivalent would be today saying oil prices went from $100 to $25 in a matter of 2 or 3 years. Global demand really just kind of cratered. There were some effects, I think, from the National Energy Program, policies that were invoked by Ottawa and the federal government at the time, which, depending on how you looked at it, maybe seemed to make some sense, but taken with the collapse of energy prices and the rules around the National Energy Program about the inability for Canadian companies to export oil, they really, in hindsight, they really did not make sense. And they really did make the situation much worse. And that's why when Brian Mulroney became the Prime Minister in 1985, he dismantled the National Energy Program and said, let's get rid of that. Those were the two biggest reasons. You know, oil, still a very, very important commodity for Alberta today, but in the early 1980s and late 70s, oil was really, I mean, about the only thing. We weren't even doing natural gas then, and we certainly weren't doing oil sands. So it was mostly the collapse of oil prices, along with some of those negative policies of the National Energy Program that really kicked the stuffing out of Alberta then.
I'd like to
One more question? Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I am on CBC, and I'm on QR77 every Friday afternoon at 4:45, if you want to listen. I've got a little thing called The Contrarian Economist, where I usually just talk about some odd, quirky little thing that normally we, you know, if we see A and we sometimes expect B, but sometimes we get a different result altogether. So I use economics to kind of explain that. Yeah, if you want to tune in.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.